one of the things I do want to bring up, because a lot of your research does really touch on the topic of climate change.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so, how exactly does your research impact or touch on the topic of climate change? I know that you do uh, officially research how stressors impact freshwater lakes. So,
Yeah.
what does that information tell us about how the Earth is changing?
Okay, well, some of the research I've been involved in is really quite long-term research. We talked earlier on about monitoring, and the data from monitoring schemes. That if they, these data sets run for decades, certainly the ones that we've been involved in, they've run for long enough now that you can actually see long-term trends in the way that ecosystems are changing, over and above the sort of year-to-year variations and day-to-day variations in how things change. And we know from our long-term water temperature records from lakes in the English Lake District that temperatures have been rising. And we actually, when we last looked at the data, just to look at these kinds of questions, we discovered, I think, that around 4 or 5 of the warmest years in our data set had occurred since the year 2000 for those lakes. So you could really see that over time there was this shift towards warming. So we can see that signal in our, if you like, our sentinel sites. Now, that's not something that's just happening in the lakes that we study. When you then go and read research from other parts of the world, from other research groups as well, you can see similar kinds of trends. And there are now increasingly more and more quite large scale studies where people have brought together data sets all across the world into the one piece of research to say, okay, well, actually, we can see on balance that warming is happening in fresh waters. And yes, there's variation in the rate of warming, but on average, we can see the signal. We can see that it's happening. So we know that temperatures are changing. We've got ample evidence for that. But we can see other things happening in these systems as well alongside the changes in water temperature. And actually, one of the areas I've been involved in is looking at the passage of the seasons, if you like. So the time of year at which a particular biological event happens. So in the dry land environment, it might be the time of year at which birds lay their eggs or plants flower. Underwater, it's the time of year when algae reach their peak abundances, or when water fleas peak, or when fish spawn, or those kinds of seasonal events. And when we've looked at long-term records of those, we've seen a shift in lots of cases towards earlier seasonal events. And that is one of the well accepted fingerprints, if you like, of a climate change impact on the natural environment. And essentially, because warming increases rates of biological processes, it speeds up biological rates. And on top of that, temperature is used as a cue by lots of different species to time their seasonal activities as well. So we're seeing warming, but we're also seeing a response in organisms. They're shifting the timing of their seasonal behaviors earlier and earlier. And that's given us now that feel for, oh, okay, so there's an impact as well. So these long-term data sets are really now showing us that that's happening, and those kinds of changes, we see them all across the world in different locations. So we know it's not just something about the peculiarities of a particular lake that we're looking at in a particular part of the world. It's rather bigger than that.
So we know there's warming. We know there are responses to warming. Do we know the causes of warming?
So there's So bearing in mind I'm not a climate scientist per se, but there is now overwhelming consensus among climate scientists that not just that warming is occurring, but also that humans have made a contribution to that. There's an anthropogenic contribution to warming as well. So there's a great deal of confidence now in that link. And actually, the reports produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, really make that statement. And there's usually there are usually quite a lot of press releases, a lot of media activity around when those reports are released. So in that sort of environment, in that scientific community, there's now a great deal of consensus about that issue.